But for tonight, to begin, we're going to start with our Parsha then. So first, let me pull up the sources for tonight. We are this week in Parshat Vayishlach. Yeah, right?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. One of the problems of preparing Shiurim and Drashot is that I always forget what this week is because I'm never in this week. I'm always trying to be 1 or 2 weeks ahead. So I'm like working on Mikate stuff now. Like we're not up to Mikates yet. But but great. So we're up to Vayishlach, and everyone can see the source sheet over here. Awesome. So the story that I really want to focus on in Vayishlach, and I guess it's important to preface this because this preface also comes with a very important trigger warning of sorts. I want to focus on the story that takes place surrounding Dinah. After the Jewish people get to Israel and they go to Shechem, Dinah is abducted and raped by one of the members of Shechem and the events that fall out from there. I want to focus on the Dinah story together. But one of the things I really hope to focus on in this class, in this section, and one of the things I hope that we have time to do tonight, I know we're going to respect the 8 o'clock deadline very strictly because we have an event coming, but I think we should have some time, is really to work on the textual familiarity of picking up on when the text is trying to tell you that something is awry. Not just trusting a Rashi or a Rishon, and not just trusting me, but really looking at the text and seeing things that stand out as peculiar. So first I want to read through the entire text together. Really, ideally, I'd want everyone to break into chavrusas and look at it together. And I'd actually love to do that for a few minutes in future class, if that's something people are interested in. We just randomly break everybody up, but there's a lot to gain that way, but also a lot to lose that way. So something to think about. But for now, I think we'll just read it together, and we'll discuss a little bit what the Parsha is telling us, so this week's Parsha is telling us about the story, this section, and then we'll maybe explore a little bit some of the questions that arise, and focus a little on the textual parallels, themes, and peculiarities that might really help us elucidate what's going on. So to that end, having given our important warning that we're going to be dealing with sensitive matters, and it's important that we get that on the table, and having framed and oriented our share, I think we can begin now with the story of Dinah, of what occurs when Yaakov leaves Lavan, leaves Padan Aram, and goes back and returns to Israel. So we have here the story of Yaakov. Source 1, Vayavo Yaakov Shalem Yershchem Asher Be'eretz Canaan. And Yaakov comes, and we look now at the translation provided by Svaria. I pulled this translation from Svaria. It translates Shalem as safe. Interesting translation of Shalem. We all know Shalem has a whole bunch of meanings. What's one meaning Shalem can mean? Anyone wants to throw something out there? Everyone's on mute. Okay, I guess it's a good thing, so I won't open up to too much.
Shalem is whole.
Whole, excellent. Shalem can mean whole. Similarly, Shalem, we can be thinking of the shoresh of shalom, of peace, which is related to wholeness, and it can mean in peace. Perhaps that's sort of where we're getting this idea of safe. But this idea of Shalem has a lot of implications and connotations. Do we know who else was someone who is described as having some shleimut already in the Torah? Who else in Bereshit is Shalem?
Avraham?
So Abraham's a good guess, but Abraham meets Malki Tzedek.
Malki Tzedek.
Exactly.
Okay.
Who is this Shalem king, the king of Shalem. So there it seems to imply a place. Perhaps here it's implying a place. Perhaps here it's implying the same quality, this attribute, and that's something we'll get back to. But we have this key interesting word. Yaakov comes Shalem to Shechem, Asher Be'eretz Canaan, which is in Canaan. Bava'o mePadan Aram, as he comes from Padan Aram by Lavan, Vichan et Pnei Ha'ir. And Yaakov camps al Pnei Ha'ir, on the face of the city, outside the city. Vayiken et Chelkat HaSadeh Asher Nata Sham Ohalo. And the piece of land which he pitched his tent was purchased. Miyad b'nei Chamor avi Shechem, from the children of Chamor, the father of Shechem, b'mei Kshita, from 100 Kshita. And of course, to us, this should all parallel a story we read together, the purchase of Marat Machpelah. Again, we have a story of one of the patriarchs giving a specific amount of money to a specific class and family and people to purchase land in Israel. So far, so good. Sounds familiar to us, following in the footsteps of Yitzchak and following in the footsteps of Abraham. But Yitzav Sham Mizbeach, this time instead of a matzeva, Yaakov builds a Mizbeach, an altar. V'yikra lo Elohei Yisrael, and he calls out to the God of Israel. And now begins the story of Dinah, all in that context, with that preface that they've come to the land of Shalem, Shechem, and that they've settled there al Pnei Ha'ir, outside the city. The Teitzei Dinah bat Leah, and Dinah, the daughter of Leah, goes out. So first of all, of course, always interesting to note how characters are described. She's being characterized as the daughter of Leah. Interesting what the connotations are there. She's not just Dinah, and she's not Dinah, the daughter of Yaakov. She's Dinah, the daughter of Leah. But Dinah, the daughter of Leah, goes out. Asher Yalda Yaakov, who was born to Yaakov. Very peculiar formulation. Leah's daughter born to Yaakov. So that should already stand out to us as sort of strange. I'd also point out that the verb, vatitze, is sort of strange. Dinah goes out. Where's she going out to? Where was she in? What's out? We already have the sense that there's an in and there's an out by the fact that Dinah goes out. So Dinah, Yaakov's, the Leah's daughter, born to Yaakov, goes out, lirot bivnot haaretz, to see the daughters of the land. An interesting idea, perhaps makes sense. She's been living at home. She's basically only seen family. Maybe it's time to meet some new people. V'yarota Shechem ben Chamor hachivi, and Shechem, the son of Chamor, the Chivi, Nasi haaretz, a prince of the land, sees her, v'yikachota, and he takes her, v'yishkavota, and he lies with her, v'ya'aneha, and he forces her. That's the characterization of Psukim. Very interesting characterization. 3 verbs. Vayikach, and he takes her. In general, what does it mean when the Bible says that a man is yikach, a man takes a woman? That usually just means consummating a marriage. That's typical biblical language for marriage consummation, and X took Y. So vayikachota, he takes Dinah, seemingly a healthy, normal marriage. V'yishkavota, he sleeps with her, which is something that one would think would be part of a normal marriage, perhaps even, or a natural next step in this relationship. But then the Torah tells us, v'ya'aneha, and it was forced, and it was coerced. So that's already a very peculiar and a very interesting formulation of what occurred. So that's something we'll get back to also, I hope, together. So now continuing. So this incident happens with Dinah. V'tidbak nasho b'Dinah bat Yaakov. And his soul was attached or glued to Dinah, the daughter of Yaakov, the Yahavetanar, and he loved the girl, the Beryl Lev Hanara, and he spoke to the heart of the girl. Shechem asks his father that can he marry her. Yaakov Shema, and Yaakov heard, Hitime et Dinah vito. Yaakov heard, what did he hear? That Dinah, his daughter, has become impure, has become sullied. His sons were with those sheep in the field. And Yaakov kept silent until they came back. Interesting what that means. What's that mean, Yaakov kept silent until the sons came back? So we'll explore that too. Clearly there's some interesting dynamic here that there's Yaakov and there's Yaakov's sons. Yaakov gets the information, but he's being judicious in how and when he shares that with his sons. Okay, so far so good. Now we have Vayetze Chamor of Shechem, a parallel, just like Dinah goes out to meet the people of Shechem. Now the leader of Shechem, Chamor, goes out, El Yaakov, to Yaakov, Ledaber Yito, to speak to him. Uvenei Yaakov ba'u min hasadeh, Yaakov's sons came from the field, Kishamam, when they heard what was going on. V'yitatvu ha'anashim, the men became upset, v'yichar lahem ma'od, and they became very angry. Why? Ki nivalah asa b'Yisrael. For a nivalah occurred in Israel. And let's see, how does Sfaria translate this? Something we'll explore together. He had committed an outrage. An outrage had been committed, a nivalah. And we'll return to what exactly that means. We'll explore this story stage by stage. But first, as I said, for those who are joining late or just signing on, I just want us all to be familiar with the facts of the story. So I see Jeff already reaching for his Robert Alter translation to see how he translates nivalah. So don't spoil it if that is what you're doing. So, ki nivalah asa b'Yisrael, for outrage had occurred in Israel, l'shkav et bat Yaakov. This is a very peculiar third-party objective description of what occurred. To lie with the daughter of Jacob was outrageous, v'chein lo yeyasa, and that was not done. Very strange description. What's it mean that was not done? Done by who? There's only one daughter of Yaakov. Did it happen or didn't it happen? What is being described here that was not done to lie with the daughter of Jacob? By Daber Chamor Yitamli more, Chamor speaks to them. Shechem b'ni chashka nafsho b'vitchem. My son Shechem loves your daughter. Tnuna ta'lo lisha. Give your daughter Dinah to Shechem, my son, as a wife. V'tchatnu otanu b'notechem tnu lanu b'notechem tichu lachem. And we'll get married, and we'll join families. They'll get married, and our daughters will give out of b'notechem. Our sons will marry of your daughters. You'll give your daughters. We'll give our sons. In other words, let's merge. Let's become one clan, one large family. We'll marry from each other. V'itanu teshevu, you'll live with us. V'aretz tiyeh lefnechem, the land will be before you. Shivu u'schura v'he'achazu ba. Live in it, sell it, grasp it. He's saying, come join us. You can have part of our land. And for those of us who have joined in the past, know we talked about in Parsha Sarah that part of the tension that goes on in all these patriarchal stories, patriarchal in the sense of dealing with our patriarchs, all of these stories of our patriarchs, of them purchasing and acquiring land, that land acquisition is a huge status symbol. Land acquisition means that you belong there, that you live there, that you're from there. And yet the Bnei Chamor are saying, great, we'll live together. We'll give you our sons, they'll marry your daughters, we'll let you live on our land. Shem says to the father and the brother, please find mercy in your eyes, and give me what I ask. I'll pay any price for the dowry. It's newly a tanar leisha, and give me your daughter as a wife. And then the children of Yaakov. Now, interestingly here, it doesn't specify which children of Yaakov at first. It just says the children of Yaakov. But the children of Yaakov answered Shechem's request to marry Dinah b'mirma, with trickery. Okay, so they answered trickery. Vaydaberu, and they spoke. Asher tima Dinah achotam, with the person who impurified, who sullied their sister Dinah. Vayomru alehem. So the sons of Yaakov now say to these people who live in Shechem, who live under the auspices, under the rule of Chamor, Vayomru alehem lo nuchal la'asot hadavar hazeh. We're not able to join you, to become one clan, to join families. To give our sister over to a man, asher lo orla, that has a foreskin. They say, we're totally on board. We want to join you guys too. We want to be one family, but we can't marry into a family that doesn't have a bris milah, that has foreskin. Ki cherpa hi lanu, because it is angry to us. It is disgusting. And a peculiar term, cherpa hi lanu. It's disgusting. Not that it's commanded, not that it's a sign from God, that it's a mitzvah. It's something that angers us. Also interesting to think of this focus on anger. When we read a pasuk before, Vayichar, they got angry at the news that Dinah was defiled. The angry brothers are threatening. The bris milah, the orla, the foreskin, not having a bris milah makes us angry. Ach bezot neot lechem. This is the only way it's going to work. And to you, kamonu, if you're like us, lihimol lechem kol zachar, to get a circumcision. But not nu ebnotena lachem ebnotechem yikach lanu. Then we can give you our daughters and take your sons. V'yishavnu itchem, and we'll live with you. V'yinu la'am echad, and we'll be one nation. Ve'im lo tishmu aleinu lihimol. And if you don't do this and you don't get a bris milah, you don't circumcise yourselves. L'kachnu bitenu v'halachnu, and you go then we'll take our sister and we'll go. You won't have her. You won't get to marry her. And Chamor was pleased with this. And his son Shechem was pleased with this. And despite how immense this ask was to have a circumcision as a completely grown adult, he was so in love with Dinah, he immediately had the circumcision to meet the standards of the Bat Yaakov. Because he wanted the daughter of Yaakov. Mikol Beit Aviv. And he was the most honored of everyone in his father's household. Very peculiar. What are we trying to communicate there? Who was the most respected of his father's house? It sounds like it's describing Yaakov. He was very interested in Yaakov, and Yaakov was the most honored in his household. Very strange. We'll get back to that. Shechem and Chamor go to the public square, and they tell everybody in the city, these men, Shleimim heim itanu. These men are shaleim. What does the translation tell us? These men are our friends. They're whole. They're honest with us. Shleimim heim itanu. V'yishvu ba'aretz. They'll live in the land. V'yischaruta. They'll do commercial business. V'aretz hinei rachva yadayim lefneihem. It's a wide land. Et benotam nikach lanu l'nashim and benoteinu nitan lahem. And we'll marry each other's children and we'll live as one nation. They just made this huge pitch. Everyone's on board. We're about to double our population. All these new potential people to marry. Just one little caveat. The one thing you need to do to be one nation, you all have to get a circumcision. So it's a hard sell. As they circumcise. I hope we have time. We have time because it's such a great joke. I don't know if people are familiar with Jim Gaffigan, but Jim Gaffigan has this great bit where he talks about how the tests in the Bible get progressively harder. where like God's like, Adam, don't eat that fruit. Noah, build a really big boat. Abraham, adult circumcision. It's like, what? How is that? So whatever. This just reminds me of that. But nonetheless, so the brothers go and they actually convince everybody that they should get a circumcision. The whole city is going to get circumcised so that they can finally join together and be one nation. All their wealth will be shared. It'll be pleasant. We'll live together. It'll be great. And all the men in the community got circumcisions. And is on the third day, when they are in the peak of pain, two of Yaakov's sons, brothers of Dinah, Shimon and Yaakov, again, pay attention to the description. We know who they are. Why do they have to give us this title? Brothers of Dinah, sons of Yaakov. But Shimon and Levi, they go, they take Ish Cherbo, their swords. They take swords and attack the city. And while these people, the men, are recovering in pain from their circumcision, they kill the entire city. It was all just a plot. They didn't care if they would get circumcised or not. They wanted them to undergo elective surgery to weaken them so they could overtake the entire city, just the two of them. Okay, so that's Chamor, but Shechem beno hargu lefi cherev. They kill Chamor, they kill Shechem, they kill the leadership, everybody. Vichu et Dinah, they take Dinah mebeit Shechem, from Shechem v'yetzu, and they go out. Bnei Yaakov bo achalulam v'yavozu ha'ir shetimu achotam. The children of Yaakov take the spoils and conquer the city which defiled their sister. Et sonam et bakaram et chomerehem et asher b'ir asher b'sadeh lechu. They took all the spoils at kochilam and kotlapam and the shehem shavu v'yavozu and kol asher b'bayit. All the men, all the women, children, servants, and spoils they took. V'yomer Yaakov Shimon ve'Levi, and Yaakov says to Shimon and Levi, Achartem oti lahavisheni biyoshvei haaretz. Yaakov says to them, you brought trouble to me, making me odious amongst the inhabitants of the land. You've made my position threatened amongst the other nations. B'knani u'beprizi, amongst the Canaanites and the Prizim. V'ani mitei mispar, I'm a few number. V'nesfu alai, they're going to gather, v'kuni v'nishmati ani uveiti, and they'll wipe me out. V'yomru, and Shimon and Levi respond to Yaakov, hakazona ya'aseh achotenu. Should our sister be treated like a prostitute? And the story ends. Yaakov doesn't respond, there's no resolution. So that is our story before we dive into it. So let's just make sure we're all on the same facts. Yaakov and the family arrive in Shechem, and they go and they camp outside the city of Shechem. Dinah goes out from their encampment and enters the city. In the city, she is taken by Shechem, the namesake of the city, the son of the leader of the city, and they have a relationship. And then he says he wants to marry her, so the leadership of the city goes out and makes a delegation to Yaakov's encampment outside the city and tries to discuss terms of marriage and dowry. The brothers say, well, our only terms are that you have to have a circumcision, and if you can circumcise the whole town, we'll get married. People think that's a bit of a strange request, but you know what, fine, we'll do it, we'll all get circumcised. And then as the town is recovering from their circumcision, the brothers come and wipe out the entire town, killing all of the men and stealing all of the women and children and spoils. And Yaakov responds angrily saying that the brothers have erred and they have threatened his position in the area. That's our story. So now given that,
it would seem as though they knew what circumcision was. It was probably more common than we think about it, because they don't ask what is involved. They already know what circumcision is.
For sure. George is raising a great point, and one that I hope that we're going to explore more about the role of the Milah, the role of the circumcision here, that their response to being asked to circumcise isn't, what the heck are you talking about? What is that? It's, okay, we'll do that. So that's 100%, and I hope we'll explore that more. I think that's such an important point, George. But just this, spot on. But just to start now that we've reviewed the whole story, to start from the very beginning, I really want to go back to this term shalem, because I really think it has a lot of significance for multiple reasons. So we pointed out that's an interesting double entendre, that the Hebrew word shalem can mean either whole, can mean peaceful, it can have multiple meanings. And I think what's fascinating, and I mentioned this actually last week in passing, but I didn't give it too much attention, but what's fascinating is that this word shalem actually appears earlier in an earlier part of the Torah, and it really firmly connects and sets the stage of what's about to occur. So if we look here, we see Vayavo Yaakov shalem, Yaakov appears whole. If we turn a few chapters back in the Torah, we turn to Perek Tet Vav, the Brit B'nai B'tarim, to where God appears to Abraham and promises him the land, a treaty which later gets solidified with the Brit Milah, another thing that will feature prominently in our story. But if we turn back to this Brit, to this covenant between God and Abraham, we see that the story says in Bereshit Tetvav in Genesis 15, in source 2 as follows. Vayomer Lavram, God says to Abraham, Yadoti da ki geri yezaracha ba'aretz lo lahem. You should know that your descendants will be a nation in a foreign land. Vavdum, they'll work hard. V'inu otam, they'll overwork them. Arba me'ot shana, for hundreds of years. V'gam et hagoy asher yavdu dan anochi, and the nation that overworks your descendants, I'll judge them. And afterwards, they'll leave very wealthy from their experience in that foreign nation. You'll return to your forefathers, to your ancestral land in peace. You'll be buried in good old age. But it'll be 4 generations until you return here, till you return to Israel. Kilo shalem avon ha'amori adhena. Why is it that you'll return to Israel and ultimately the Jewish people and Abraham's descendants will inherit the land of Israel? For the Amori, the people of the Amori, are not shalem. They are not whole. They are not honest. So it's clear that in some way, shalem indicates something about being an honest person, about being a whole person, a person who doesn't sin and doesn't lie. Being shalem means that you merit God's land. And we see that in the connection between our story and Abraham. And I think that's something that's going to be central to what we're discussing. But I also want to just point out one other point, and this is what I raised last week. Rav Soloveitchik points out that in the Brit B'nai B'tarim, in the prophecy that describes the rest of the Torah, the contract between Abraham and God that describes the future of the Jewish people, we know that famously God puts a time limit of 400 years of when this is going to take place. But that doesn't happen. At the end of the day, it's a couple hundred years until the Jewish people experience Egypt and are freed. So we have various interpretations, various explanations why that's the case, but let's just put that aside. When we put aside the time frame, when we put aside this promise of up to 400 years, what we're left with is a description to the T of Yaakov. Yaakov's children are 4 generations away from Abraham. The 4th generation from Abraham is returning to Israel, returning to Abraham's land after serving unfairly, working for less money than they should have, working for twice as many years as they should have, in a foreign land, in Padan Aram, not Israel, not the Jewish homeland. Finally, Yaakov takes the Jewish nation, which has just been built, which has just been born, and Yaakov returns to Israel. And this is the moment of return. This is the moment of Geula, of redemption, says Rav Soloveitchik. Yaakov has the very first opportunity in history to bring redemption, to bring a messianic end, to settle Israel permanently, and for everything to be fine. And that's the stage in which this story is set. This story, and the rest of Sefer Bereshit, I will contend, is telling us why Yaakov and the Jewish people messed up, why they didn't merit for this to be the final time, why we weren't ready yet, why we weren't ready to play that important role as a nation, as a part of geopolitics, as a part of international dialogue, how we weren't ready yet to serve that role of getting God's message across to the other nations. We weren't ready yet to serve that end game goal of settling Israel for the long term, settling Israel and getting God's message out there. So all of that, I think, can be contained, it can be expressed in this reference to Shalem. But I think there's a whole nother meaning to Shalem beyond this connotation of wholeness, of honesty, of lack of sin. But just before I move on from that, I want to make sure everyone heard of Soloveitchik's beautiful interpretation, if that makes sense, that our framing right now is that Yaakov is triumphantly returning to Israel for the very first time, married with children and wealth and status, and he's on the precipice of fulfilling God's promise to Abraham of settling Israel and starting an end goal game of a Jewish Israel nation. So far, so good?
Yes.
All right. So what I want to point out, though, is that the word shalem has multiple meanings. And I want us to be sensitive to this. It's something I'll develop more throughout the story, but its multiple meanings are definitely part of the intent of the word choice here, that this is keying us in to a pun, to some sort of interesting play on words. So we go now from the settlement, and I'll point out again that the settlement here is Al Pnei Ha'ir. It's outside the city. And the reason this is important is because the Torah emphasizes it. Every time Yaakov and the Jewish people talk to the people of Shem, it's prefaced with the verb, vatetze, vayetze. You're going out. People are always leaving their home for this interaction. Because Yaakov didn't move into Shechem, he moved right outside Shechem. You're leaving your home, you're leaving your comfort zone. And all this takes us to V'tetzei Dina. Dina leaves her home, and she goes to the city of Shechem, V'yarto Shechem ben Chamor, and she sees Shechem ben Chamor, and we pointed to this interesting verb formulation, V'yikachota, V'yishkavota, V'ya'aneha. First, the typical biblical formulation of marriage, and he took her, and male took female is the typical biblical formulation in Hebrew. Then V'yishkavota, a perhaps more intimate or maybe even vulgar expression in biblical Hebrew, and he slept with her. And then after that, after this perhaps nuptial preface, followed by a sexual interaction, then we get the description of V'ya'aneha, and he coerced her. And what's really interesting is that this has opened up a world of interpretation, a world of discussion as to understanding Dina's perspective, understanding what really occurred. And now, before we go into this discussion, I really want to make it very clear that I really am sensitive and understand that during times like this, discussions around such sensitive issues and potentially triggering issues, like things like rape and abuse, are very sensitive and very difficult. And at no point do I want to be triggering or offensive. And again, at no point am I apologizing for an inappropriate or abusive action. But I do want to engage a little bit in some of the discussion around the question of, was Dina really raped? And now, this is not a moral question. This is not a question, was it okay how Shechem acted? This is a historical question. Was Shechem abusive? It's not apologizing for the act if he was, but it's a historical question of, is the Torah trying to communicate to us that a rape occurred? So I just famously, this came up in somewhat recent, somewhat modern, popular discussion because of the famous book, The Red Tent. I don't know if people have heard of it. If not, don't feel bad. You're not missing out on that much. But there was a fictionalized account of the Genesis story years back called The Red Tent, which is very interesting and really could be summed up in many ways as a modern midrash, a modern take of filling in the gaps of the part of the story that we're not told about. And it was very controversial for all types of reasons. A modern take on the forefathers and on the Bible is bound to be controversial. But perhaps one of the most famously controversial parts of The Red Tent was that it contended that Dina was not raped, but rather she willingly ran away from home. She was sick of living in a paternalistic, controlled home lifestyle with all men and her brothers and her father, and she was living in Nowheresville, Padan Aram. Finally, she gets to the city, she gets to Shechem, and she's excited, and Dina runs away from home. So that's very interesting. I see that Kretzel asked the question. So Kretzel says, if the word V'ya'aneha means force, doesn't that imply rape? That's an excellent question and one we're going to explore. We're going to explore the textual points. Thank you for raising that, Kretzel. But for now, just to focus on this midrash, on this alternative interpretation, I just want to play a clip from the Lifetime television show of The Red Tent, which came out a few years ago. But I just want to show how, on the one hand, this is very shocking, but on the other hand, this is not a vulgarization of Tanakh, but an attempt to understand Dina. It's an attempt to breathe life into a character that we just really don't know much about. So I want to take a minute, or really 3 minutes and 46 seconds here, to watch this depiction, both to get a sense of what is modern midrash, what is living midrash, how can we look at these stories and give them meaning that isn't necessarily obvious, like the rabbis did hundreds of years ago, but also to really think about what this is adding in our perception of Dina and the stakes of the story. So this now picks up that Dina has come to the city of Shechem. In the imagination of the Red Tent, it's not because she was Stam running away. It's because she and Rachel are midwives, and they need a midwife in the city of Shechem. Doesn't really matter the backstory. But we see here the interaction of Dina and Shechem. We see their interaction one of the times that they're meeting. So I'm going to play it.
That is not this sweet.
Can everybody hear when I play it too? Is the volume on too? Okay, I'm going to play it.
All that is the scent of the lotus flower. In Egypt, they're considered sacred.
Why?
Well, because they're timeless. A symbol of birth and rebirth. At night, they close up, retracting into water, but each day they open up again. Their blooms reborn.
My mothers would love that story.
They say it's powerful enough to make even the ducks and fish swoon.
And what makes you swoon?
Looking at you.
So he's here. Who? I don't think you would see him again. But he is real, and it's just like you said. It's like a storm. His name is Shalem, and he's the son of the king and the queen. What have you done? Nothing you yourself didn't do when you fell in love with father. In love? You just met him. So you knew right away. You said I'd be lucky if it ever happened to me, and it has happened.
Talk about it on the way home. We need to leave right away if we're to make it back before dark. Let's go.
I'm afraid you cannot leave.
At least not Dina.
That's Shchem's mother.
The king has asked that she stay on a few days to help Abby during her confinement.
The king is.
I will have to ask her father for permission. He's a man of honor, as is my husband. Have no fear. We shall take good care of her. My guards will escort you back to your camp. Listen to me. Remember who you are and where you come from. Be humble and protect your honor. What was that you spoke?
Egyptian. I was schooled there. My mother's family's from Thebes.
So you've been across the sea then?
I am.
That's very beautiful. Well, as I imagine a prince would be.
Because I intimidate you.
Because you don't.
Prince, you.
I would tell him he must bring me things first.
Just out of concern for time, I think that's enough, but we get the idea. Clearly, it's depicting what I think is actually a somewhat interestingly complicated depiction. Because on the one hand, obviously, it's showing a love relationship between Dina and Shchem, or at least some amount of intimacy between the two of them, which then goes on to a physical intimate scene, which we don't have to watch together. But it's depicting some amount of intimacy. But on the other hand, it is very forthright with the fact that Shchem's parents basically just lie and use their royal authority to abduct Dina. Rachel goes home. Dina's going to go home with Rachel. And then the queen says, oh, you can't leave. You have to stay here because my son needs you. So I just want to point out that even in the red tent depiction, it's not just as simple as, oh, Dina is like a frivolous young girl who runs away from home, but it's actually this complicated interaction where perhaps Dina does even have some amount of reflected relationship with Shchem, but there's an inappropriate use of power and authority to ensure that she stays there. Now, all that's just to point out, and I want to also note and really give respect to what Margie Siegel said about being revisionist, which she said in the chat. I think it's totally fair. I think there's definitely time where even if it's an interesting theoretical discussion or Torah discussion, reinterpreting the Torah to minimize the wrong accosted against Dina can just serve the purpose of minimizing these wrongs in general and ignoring them. And that's certainly not what we're trying to do and not our goal, but rather I think it's a very interesting and very different take on the story, and one I want to develop a little bit more. If we view this, not even the full apology, not even Dina was willing or anything like that, but if we view this as somehow a complicated interaction between two nations meeting for the very first time. Dina has lived in Padan Aram her whole life. She is a small town home girl. Yaakov has similarly lived amongst family his whole life. And we have them get to a metropolitan city for the first time, and we have this interaction. And now somehow something happens that Dina ends up with Shchem, ends up with one of the significant members of the community. So now I want to explore just a little bit more that nature of that interaction. Again, being sensitive and not trying to apologize or minimize rape or the reality of it or the tragedy of it, but just trying to make a different point in the story. I want to explore what Kressel pointed out. We know that the verse says, V'ya'aneha, and he forced her. End of story. That means rape. So we see here that the Torah says, V'yikachota Shchem takes Dina, which we pointed out is nuptial language in the Bible. V'yishkavota, he sleeps with her, V'ya'aneha, and he forces her. So I just want to point out, and again, this is not apologizing, agreeing with, or taking a stance on the obvious wrongs of rape and abuse, etc. But I want to point out textually, in the language of the Torah, V'ya'aneha doesn't actually imply rape. And now the reason why this is, my proof of this as this case, is that the Torah later on in Devarim discusses the laws surrounding rape. And now, and again, more of a trigger warning, the Torah has a much more limited and perhaps uncomfortable definition of rape than we would nowadays. But what's important to point out is that in describing coercive, forced, non-consensual relations, the Torah says, the Torah has two separate cases. The Torah has two separate cases that it describes, that it discusses. One is that takes place in a metropolitan city in a very busy area, and the wife says that she was raped, and the Torah says, and this is something that would be very difficult for all of us and something that deserves its own discussion, but the Torah says since it was in a metropolitan area and there's so many people around, she probably was consensual, so both the woman and the husband should die for adultery. That's the conclusion of the Torah. I don't want to discuss the morality behind that and the implications of it right now. I think that's an important question. I think it's very difficult and something we can discuss. But in the eyes of the Torah, what I want to point out is that even though it uses the language of ina, of coercion, al davar asher ina et eshet re'ehu, the Torah is not talking about a rape or coercive relationship. It's talking about an inappropriate and non-halachic one. That ina, that coercion, can also imply just an inappropriate relationship. And I think perhaps that could be partially because the Torah takes a little bit of the agency out of female sexuality involved in the relationship. That if there's an inappropriate action, she's held accountable. She still gets killed for adultery too. But the man is being really, he's the driving force. He's the one that the Torah is assuming. But irrespective if you agree or not, what's clear is that the Torah has two standards. One is non-halachic forbidden relationships that result in the man and the woman getting killed by the Beit Din. But the other is represented in the next pasuk. If this event takes place in a field and somewhere where she won't be heard, again, a disturbing idea, etanara hamurasa, the hechzik ba ha'ish, and the man grabs her, uses force, then in that case it's considered rape. And I want to point out that it's only considered rape when there's a verbiage of a hechzik ba is used. And I think this is actually telling because there's one other famous story of rape and abuse in the Torah, and that is the rape of Tamar by Amnon, her brother. And in that story in Shmuel, when it's describing rape, it says explicitly in Pasuk 11, that Amnon approached Tamar, and he forced her, and he said, sleep with me. And then she said, don't force me. So this is clearly a throwback to our story with Dinah, the exact same lashon, the exact same language. Such is not done in Israel to do a novella like this. But that's not what I want to focus on necessarily right now. I want to focus on the formulation. Again, we see it in Pasuk 14 and verse 14, when Amnon actually rapes his sister. It says, "V'yechazek memena." He forces her, v'ya'aneh, and he coerces her, v'yishkavata, and he lies with her. Because again, in the Bible, when it's talking about the most extreme case of abduction and coercion and violence, the language v'yechazek is always present. So I just want to point out that there is actually an interesting discussion to be had here, that it seems to me the pshat of what the Torah is presenting is as follows. Dinah legitimately might find Shem interesting, might want some type of relationship with Shem. But Shem, either through an abuse of power, an abuse of position, or literally just physical abuse or physical force, capitalized on that interest and that desire to expand her horizons, to meet new people, maybe even to fall in love, and used his authority to try and coerce her into marriage. But there's clearly a difference between the other cases of rape in the Bible in this case. Because, for example, as soon as Amnon rapes his sister, the Bible goes on to discuss the various impact of how he was disgusted by her and how that was not a truly loving act, how it was a violent act and a disgusting act. But the Torah doesn't say anything about that in our case. The Torah just says how much Shem loved Dinah and how he'd give up anything for her. Now, again, that's not to apologize. That's not to say whatever amount of coercion or force he used was acceptable, but that's merely just to note that the Torah's perspective is expressing here is that while something inappropriate happened, it is a case of inoi, it's a case of coercion, it's a case of inappropriate relationship. It's not clear that we're talking about Dinah just being abducted. So I just want to give all that as a backdrop to try and explain my theory of the entire story. And I'm just going to put my theory forward just because we have such a tight deadline with the 8 o'clock Erev event. And then if we have time after, you can ask me. If we have time after the Erev event, feel free to stick around and ask me. So I want to present my theory. And I think my theory and my read is entirely predicated, not entirely, but opens up with this idea that shleimim anachnu is really a double entendre, but not in the sense that we pointed out. Because the word shalem actually has a lot of very interesting implications. For example, we mentioned before, what is the first time Shalem appears in the Torah? Malchi Tzedek Melech Shalem, the king of Shalem. Now, people should note that generally this is considered a biblical literary technique, and I think it's actually just an ancient textual literary technique. But when you're trying to define or understand an unusual verb, word, appearance, how do you understand it? Look at the context in which it first appears. That gives you an understanding of how it should be interpreted in the future. And we know that in its first appearance, Shalem is a location. And the reader of Sefer Bereshit is familiar with this location of Shalem, because they already read his king. Malchi Tzedek is the king of Shalem. But now what we have is Vayavo Yaakov Shalem. Yaakov comes to Shalem, honest, maybe, in peace, safe, as Sephardi says, certainly, but I think it also means Shalem, the location. It's a geographic location. Yaakov comes to the location of Shalem, the larger region which Malchi Tzedek was the king of, and within that larger region, he comes to the city of Shechem, Ir Shechem. He comes to the region of Shalem, the city of Shechem, Asher Be'eretz Canaan B'Vom B'Padan Aram, which is in this area. So stage one, we've arrived at Shalem, whole, safe, and perhaps in a geographic area. So then, once we're here, Yaakov camps al Pnei Ha'ir, outside the city. And right away that should tell you what's about to occur is going to be some sort of tension surrounding Yaakov's relationship to that city. Why doesn't Yaakov move into the city? Why doesn't he move in and live with everybody else? Why is he living outside the city? So that frames our discussion. And that's emphasized by pointing out that Dinah, when she wants to go check out the city and meet some new friends, see the girls that live in town, V'teitze, she has to leave where she lives because her father didn't move into the city. They're living outside on their own in their own little encampment. So Dinah goes out to meet the girls of the city to get some socialization, to meet friends for the first time, and she ends up with the wrong relationship. She ends up with a relationship that was inappropriate, perhaps coerced, but an inappropriate or wrong relationship with Shechem. Perhaps, as the red tent posits, while the surroundings of the relationship was inappropriate, it was consensual and she wanted to be with him. Perhaps not. That's an interesting question, a historical question, but she ends up in this inappropriate relationship. Then Yaakov hears about it, and Yaakov knows that he can't trust his sons. And I want to develop a little more. Why can't he trust his sons? What's wrong with the brothers? Why does he know he has to take a step back, and he has to wait for them all to come home before he tells them? So for some reason, Yaakov thinks he can't trust the sons, and that's expressed in the Psukim and the Torah telling us, first Yaakov hears, then he waits. So then how do the sons react? First, the Torah tells us, they react extremely emotionally. Yitatzvu, they got sad. Vayichar lahem ma'od, they got very angry. And they say, Ki nevalah asa b'Yisrael. A nevalah has occurred in Israel. So I want to open to the floor. What's a nevalah? What's that mean? We said before that Sefaria translates nevalah as outrageous. But what's a nevela? What's that word generally mean?
A carcass. Nevela is a carcass. That's probably related to it. A shame, but a carcass.
Excellent. Joel is referring to its meaning in the context of kudshim, in the context of the laws of ritual sacrifice. And in that context,
it carries tumor.
Exactly. And in that, perfect. Both of you spot on. In that context, a nevela means an inappropriately slaughtered animal, which is ritually impure. And we see here that we see in the Psukim, I'll just quote one pasuk that tells us about this. For example, in Dvarim Yudalid, in Deuteronomy 14, the Torah tells us, Lo tochlu kol nevela, you shall not eat any animal that has not been properly ritually slaughtered through a shechita, an act of ritual Jewish slaughter. L'gerish b'sharechet etnana, give it to your non-Jewish neighbor who's allowed to eat that meat. V'achla o machar l'nachri, and he'll eat it. O machar l'nachri, or sell it to a random non-Jew. Ki am kadoshata, for your holy nation l'Hashem Elokecha. So we see that there's this prohibition that you're not allowed to eat an nevela, an animal that's not properly slaughtered, and it carries impurity to it. And on one level, that makes sense, because we know that the repeated theme in this section is impurity. Dinah is defiled. Dinah is impure. And this is even a familiar biblical language, because impurity is the language the Torah uses to refer to infidelity in marriage. The sota, the woman who's accused of cheating on her husband, is referred to as being tameh, as being impure. When someone cheats on their husband, that's considered a question of tumah, of impurity. Cheating on your wife is a question of tumah, of impurity. Because the idea of infidelity, of inappropriate sexual relationship is tied to impurity, for whatever reason. That's also a whole interesting shiur to discuss. And that's why we have a comparison to an nevela, to an impure carcass. And I think that's perhaps true. I think that's a very interesting idea. But I want to put forth a different idea. Because right now, where we are in Bereshit, we don't know anything about nevelas. We don't know about korbanos. We don't know about the laws of ritual sacrifice. None of that stuff exists anymore. So it would be a pretty obscure reference to be making that, violated the ritual law of future Jewish slaughter. So maybe it just meant generally a carcass. Or maybe it just meant generally a disgusting thing. Or generally an impure thing. And that ended up being focused onto an inappropriately slaughtered animal, maybe. But I want to focus on a different interpretation. Because we know in Sefer Bereshit, while we never hear of a nevela as an animal, as a carcass, we do see the shorish bila, the shorish biloi, in a different context. And it has a different meaning in Bereshit, I want to argue. So if we look now earlier in Bereshit, to the end of the story of Migdal Bavel, of the Tower of Babylon, where all the people in the world teamed up to build a giant tower to the sky to attack God, God responds by mixing up their language so they can no longer communicate together and they can no longer build a tower. And what does God say? In source 7, God says, this is in the story of Migdal Bavel and the Tower of Babylon, Havan nirda, let me go down, let us, him and the ministering angels, go down, v'navala sham sifatam, and let me mix up their language. Because the word bila, nivala, nivela, also shares a root with the term of mixing and intermixing. That it's mixing things up, some sort of inappropriate mixing that's occurring. Similarly, we see this root, this word used in a similar way in Shemot. The Torah tells us in source 8, Yitro tells Moshe it's not good that you do all of the judgment for the entire Jewish nation alone. Why? Navol tibol gamata. You'll end up navol. What's that mean? Says the Bechor Shor. Yishlamar navol tibol lashon irbov. You'll get mixed up. If you're handling every single case for all the Jews, you're bound to get mixed up and make the wrong decision. Because again, the Shoresh bila also means to mix things up. And that's expressed all the time. There's expressions in the Mishnah and the Talmud, in Aramaic, Rabbinic Hebrew, Biblical Hebrew, of this word bila being used as a mixture. Now, the reason why I think this is essential is because I think essentially what we're learning about here is a story of geopolitics and diplomacy. Yaakov's about to start his first nation, the Jewish nation, to make Israel a national force, a national power, fulfill God's promise. And of course, what's one of the most important things a nation does, much less a small nation like Yaakov that doesn't even have land acquisition yet? Treaties, diplomacy, interacting with the other nations around it. But when this moment arises, when the opportunity comes, what does Yaakov do? He starts off on the wrong foot and he shies away. He plants his camp al Panei Ha'ir, outside the city. He creates that distance between him. And then the story goes on, and despite Yaakov's distance, despite Yaakov taking a step back, his daughter ends up in the arms of one of the people who lives in the city. And it's a huge problem, and the brothers are so angry. But why are the brothers angry? Ki nevala asa b'Yisrael. An inappropriate intermixing, a miscegenation has taken place in Israel. L'shkovet ba Yaakov, to sleep with Yaakov's daughter. V'chein lo ye'asa. And that is not done in our family, in our culture. V'chein lo ye'asa is not an appeal to halacha, to God's will, to prophecy. It's a cultural statement, a sociological observation. That's not done. That's not how Jacob's family does things. They have violated our norms. In other words, says the children of Yaakov, these foreigners, these outsiders, want to join in forces with us. They want to be a community with us. And they violate our norms and they don't respect how we do things. So far, so good. So far, that all makes sense. That's a legitimate complaint. And we saw that the way that Dino was taken was complicated. But the problem is the way they respond, the way they deal with that. Because instead of respecting that these people just don't know your norms, they just don't know the difference between you, and teaching them to build a stronger teamwork to try and help build the Jewish nation, to try and help build the Jewish people, instead they respond with dishonesty and deceit. And they take that opportunity of cultural understanding and of teamwork and togetherness, and use that as a manipulation to hurt them. Because what is it that they ask them to do? And this goes back to the point George made. They ask them to get a circumcision. And why isn't everyone so surprised? Why isn't everyone saying, what do you mean? Circumcision is just the sign of Abraham and God's ritual relationship. Because to them, a circumcision is not a statement about Abraham. It's a statement about what we do. It's their culture. It's their social reality. We're all circumcised. If you want to join us, you have to get circumcised too. Because they're saying if you want to be in one nation, we have to work together to reflect each other's national values, cultural values. We have to be respectful and intermix well. And the brothers, and that's a completely reasonable request. That's why, of course, Shalem and all the people in the city, they say, of course. And more than that, I want to focus on exactly their response. What does Shechem say to the people of the city? Shlemim heimi tanu. And here I think the double entendre is so powerful. They're honest. They're Shalem, but more than that, they're Shlemim. They're of the same region. They want to be part of us. They want to be New Yorkers too. They want to be Americans too. They want to be Israelis. They want to be Canaanites. We're living in the land of Shalem, and those people, I've seen a good Shlemim. Those are good Shlemim. Those are true compatriots. But when given that opportunity to really be a part of the land, be a part of the nation, to work together and to team up together, What do? They take advantage of it and use that willingness to understand, to expand culturally, to respect bris milah, to respect Jewish norms, and they use that as a manipulative moment to undermine that relationship and to kill the city of Shechem. And that's the sin of the brothers. And that's what gets Yaakov so upset. That Yaakov realizes it's not just that they committed a horrible atrocity, they killed tons of people. It's that they showed that the word of Jacob is meaningless. That it doesn't matter, you can't trust them. They're going to take exactly the treaty, the very openness and willingness to discuss things that you presented, and use that as a weakness to attack you. So why even bother? Diplomacy's out the window, the only thing left is militarism. So says Yaakov, I'm outnumbered. I have no hope. If I can't be diplomatic, if I can't forge relationships because you, my children, are going to undermine them, then we're just going to get wiped out in a military fight. And thus the story of Shechem, in addition to understanding what happened with Dinah and her personal story and the wrong that occurred there, from the national perspective, the story of Shechem is the importance of diplomacy, the importance of being an international player, and the importance of being respectful and open-minded in this international space, being honest and willing to partner, willing to join, as necessary for starting a Jewish nation. And now just to finalize, I think all of this finally comes to head years later, because we see that when the legitimate statement is made by Shimon and Levi, Dinah was wrongfully taken. Should our sister be like a prostitute? Yaakov doesn't respond. He says nothing. But I think Yaakov's response comes years later, because years later, Yaakov gives a bracha, gives a final blessing to all of his children, and I think there we see his response to Shimon and Levi. Because there Yaakov says, Shimon v'Levi achim, Shimon and Levi are brothers, klei chamas machorotehem. Their weapons are tools of lawlessness. Clearly displeased, referencing back to this moment, this event where they upset him. V'sodam al tavo nafshi, let not my person be included in their council. Pikahal al tachid kvodi, let not my being counted in their assembly. Kiva apam hargu ish, for in anger they killed men over tzonam yakrushor, and out of their will they maimed oxen. Arura pam ki az, cursed is their anger, v'ratam ki kashata. Now this is the part I want to focus on. Achal kem b'Yaakov, I'll spread them out amongst Jacob, v'afitzim b'Yisrael, and I'll expand them and spread them throughout Israel. Says Midrash, what's it mean that Shimon and Levi are going to be spread throughout Israel? Zeh Shimon shelo haya chalko mechuber b'yachad. This refers to Shevet Shimon because the tribe of Shimon never inherited a contiguous piece of land. And Levi, elu kohanim v'levim shelo hayu lehem chelek in Israel. And this is the Levites who never got a continuous piece of land. In other words, what's Yaakov's final word to Shimon and Levi? You have to spread yourselves out and get out there. You have to meet different people. You have to live throughout the land. You can't all just congregate in one little area, in one little territory, and all live together, feeding off each other. No, says Yaakov, you guys have to get out there, expand throughout the land. You're not going to get one inheritance. Shimon and Levi are the only tribes that are spread out throughout Israel. Because Yaakov sees what's wrong when they're given the opportunity to look at the other as those not deserving of respect, not deserving of trust, not deserving of being treated on this global diplomatic scale with honesty. So says Yaakov, the future of Israel is dependent on you guys spreading out amongst Israel, meeting different people, meeting diverse people, and developing your ability for diplomacy, for open-mindedness, and for relationship beyond just militarism. And so we return to the story, and we see how the story in the view of the Rav, that the stage is being set as a story of major historic national significance. The Jewish people return to Israel for the first time, and we should view this as their first shot of a nation. And what happens? They mess it up. They make a mistake. They don't have the proper international skills, but they work on it. And I think what we'll see and what we'll keep coming back to as we go through the Yosef story starting next week, and I'm sure those who've been following the Yosef story Monday night already know much about this, but what we'll see and what we'll work on is how the Yosef story in many ways was their second shot, and spoilers, it doesn't go so well either. But thank you, everybody. I hope that was an interesting take on the story. I hope it explained a lot of things. Personally, I find the message very insightful, that an important part of starting a nation, in addition to wealth and power and militarism, is this ability to be a respectful diplomat, to trust each other, to be open-minded and come to the table. And I think it's a really powerful point that the Torah is making here.